Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather, and welcome to 2023. We're starting off the year with a pretty disturbing case. We're going to discuss the James Bulger case out of Liverpool, England. And this was requested a few times last year, but it was a really hard one for me. I put it off a lot because not only was the victim a child, the murderers were also very young children. And as a mom, it was a lot. There's a lot of information, so let's just jump right in. Denise Bulger, the mother of James, grew up in a big family with about 12 siblings in Northwood, Kirkby, in Liverpool, England. Her family were really close and really happy. And being that there were so many of them, the home was always loud and a bit chaotic, but Denise would remember most of all that there was a lot of love. Her mother, Eileen, was an amazing mother, and having such an amazing role model really made Denise want a family of her own. She always dreamed of settling down, getting married, and having kids. And in fact, when her older siblings settled down and had babies, Denise was known as the baby hogger because she never passed up a chance to snuggle with one of her little nieces or nephews. In her early 20s, Denise would meet her future husband, Ralph, in a nightclub and fell in love instantly. Denise and Ralph moved in together pretty quickly, and Denise started planning her family. They were together for just under 2 years before they got pregnant with their first daughter. This pregnancy went really well, Denise was healthy, and the pregnancy was textbook, so they were very excited. Sadly, while Denise was in labor at the hospital, her baby suddenly passed away. Christy Bulger was born February 22nd, 1989, weighing only 3 pounds, 5 ounces. Denise was heartbroken after losing her first child, but they decided to quickly get married and try again to make a family right away because having kids was something Denise always wanted. After only 4 months of losing Christy, she was pregnant with James. James grew to be the most funny, outgoing little toddler. He was hardly ever grumpy and just loved to be the center of attention. He also never really walked. He mostly just ran around, even if it was from one room to the next. He also loved chocolate and chipsticks. One of his favorite things was Denise reading to him. He knew his ABCs and was potty trained as well, which made him very proud. Being that James came from a big extended family, he also loved other kids. He trusted all of his cousins and adored them. On February 12, 1993, Denise would wake up and get James dressed in a cute little gray tracksuit with white stripes down the sides. She wanted to take James to her mother's house that morning, so she also put on his puffy navy hooded anorak coat. Her mother wasn't home, but 2 of her brothers were, as were her sister. So they all visited, had some tea while the kids played. Everyone lived nearby the mom, so it was a place where everyone met up, visited, even if she wasn't around. Just around noon, Nicola, her sister-in-law, arrived with another one of the nieces because she was babysitting. Nicola would mention that she needed to go to the Strand, a local mall in Bootle, Maryside, England. Nicola needed to exchange some clothes at the mall. Denise also had errands to run and thought it would be easiest to get them done if James had Vanessa, her niece, who Nicola was babysitting, to keep him company, so she agreed. A decision that would always haunt Denise later is leaving James's buggy or stroller at home. Nicola didn't have a lot of space in her trunk, or boot as they say, so she decided to just hold James's hand and try and get the errands done quickly. Denise had never left the buggy at home before this day. She always preferred to have James safely buckled in. The Strand had been extremely busy this day, loads of people rushing around getting ready for the weekend. They had a good time, the clothes were exchanged, and the kids rode on some kiddie rides. Now, James had actually gone out of sight at one point very briefly and was only about 2 yards away from Denise. But James came back right away and got really upset that he scared himself and his mother. For the most part, James was doing great, but he was running out of steam, as kids do. But they had one more errand to run. Around 3:30 p.m., they went to the butcher's to grab something for tea, which is known to us in North America as dinner or supper, depending on where you live. The butcher shop was fairly small, but busy, so Denise had James by the hand to keep him close. He was definitely getting antsy at this point, and he just wanted to go home. Nicola and her niece Vanessa were being served at a corner near the freezers in the back, I believe, and Denise was closest to the front door. She picked out some pork chops and looked down at James again to ask him to stay put while the butcher wrapped the chops up for her. Denise would briefly let go of James's hand to take her purse off her shoulder, set it down, and reached into her purse to get her wallet. She also rummaged around a bit to find some change. But within those 10 seconds that she was in her purse, James had disappeared. Denise turned around to see if he had ran to the back to Nicola, but Nicola didn't know where he went. So Denise immediately ran out of the shop, looked left and right, but the shops were really busy this day and she couldn't see him. Denise would remember that her heart was beating out of her chest, and her biggest regret was that she chose to go left instead of going right. Sadly, James was led away from the shops to the right. James was reported missing at the mall security kiosk, and a routine search was done of all the shops. Denise was frantic, running in and out of the shops, desperate to find her little boy. She remembered security even lightheartedly telling her that he was probably just in Woolworths playing in the toy section. After a while, a small crowd would start to gather and assist Denise in searching. And Denise was hysterical and felt like security wasn't really taking her seriously. We have to remember security probably has to find several kids a week that go missing. So this was probably not out of the ordinary to them, and missing kids are typically found. At 4:22, 40 minutes after James disappeared, police were called. Police also searched the shops again, and one officer with a PA system drove around outside on a motorcycle searching for James, thinking he was just missing. They were hoping he had just wandered off, but nobody knew at this point that James had been abducted. Police were concerned by how much time had passed. Typically, the first hour, often referred to as the golden hour, is the time frame that's most important when someone goes missing. The Strand was big and had 110 shops with 5 entrances, loads of stairs, a car park, so it took a long time to search. By 5:30 p.m., the shops were closing with no signs of James. Denise was taken to the police station, but she struggled with this because she didn't want to leave the last place where her baby was. She wanted to keep looking and keep fighting for him. Ralph, her husband, would be notified, and police would bring him to the station as well, but not before searching their home. Police also questioned Ralph and Denise to rule out if they had anything to do with James's disappearance. Meanwhile, over 100 police officers, friends, family, community members were all outside searching everywhere to try and find little James. Everyone was frantic that a 2-year-old was missing. It would be close to bedtime on a freezing cold winter's night, so it was important that he be brought back and reunited with his mother. At midnight, Denise was taken back to the Strand to review some CCTV footage. The first frame she was shown was a shot right outside the butcher's shop at 3:39 p.m. of a boy who looked like he was running out of the store. Denise verified that it was in fact James. Less than 1 minute later, the next frame would show Denise outside the shop. And this was the beginning of her frantic search when she realized that James was no longer in the butcher's. The police would continue to review the tapes and asked Denise to go home, go get some rest, and reassured her that she could go back to the station anytime that she wanted. So Denise reluctantly agreed. She went to her mom's, had a shower, but only lasted there for about an hour before insisting to be taken back. She couldn't eat or sleep without her baby and wanted to be a part of the search. A witness came forward the following morning and said that they saw a young child crying by the canal that runs along the shops. And this prompted an underwater search team to search the canal Saturday morning. While the search was underway, the police were still reviewing the CCTV footage and would see that James had already been led away by 2 other boys holding hands with one to the upper level by the time Denise ran around the lower level. It looked like it happened so fast, and Denise really didn't have a chance to catch him. Unfortunately, it was a blurry image and hard to see who these other boys could be. It was also confusing to everyone because what did these other boys want with a 2-year-old? Where would they have taken him? This also posed a problem with the initial search because when Denise and the community had been searching the shops, people were looking for a single child alone, not a child with 2 other boys. James had also been taken out of the mall in under 2 minutes. So by the time security was notified, he was already gone. When police saw that James was with 2 other boys, there was a small sense of relief. Maybe they got lost, or maybe it was a prank. Was it possible that they had him hidden somewhere and were scared to get in trouble? Police needed to speak with these boys and ask where they left him. Was he okay? Was he hungry, upset, cold? He needed to be brought home immediately. After 17 hours from when James went missing, police did a media statement with Denise begging for her son back.
If you've got me baby, just bring him back.
She broke down and wasn't able to say much, but Ralph stayed to try and answer any questions. After the media release happened, informing the public that there were 2 older boys with James, loads of tips came in. One woman said that she saw a young boy with 2 slightly older boys. She had asked the boys about James, and they claimed they had found him. The baby looked like he had injured his forehead, but they were about a mile away from the Strand, so she wasn't sure it was the same people. Now, I don't know why she didn't call the police then when they told her that they had found a baby. And this seems to be a question I see with a lot of cases I research. People just don't want to get involved, or they don't want to bother police in case it's nothing. So they talk themselves out of helping. A dog walker had also seen the 3. To her, the younger boy didn't seem to belong, and it seemed odd that they were with a 2-year-old without a parent. She assumed the other boys were teenagers, and probably one was a brother, so she didn't call police either. Media started to camp out in front of Denise's home, which just added stress to the whole situation. Denise also remembers that someone prank called the house saying, quote, "We've got him, Denise. We've got your little boy," end quote. This was an extremely difficult time, and Denise was restless, waiting around to hear any news. Then on Sunday, police would take Denise out to drive around, looking for James, but mostly to give Denise something to do, to get her out of the house. She hated waiting around at home, so she wanted to be actively looking. Constable Mandy Waller, the officer taking Denise for a drive, got a call to come back to the station immediately and to turn her radios off. Denise's heart sank. She knew in her heart that this was about James. Sadly, Denise still had to wait another 40 minutes until an officer finally told her that they found James, but it was not good news. A group of boys had been playing around Walton Lane Police Station nearly 3 miles from the Strand. They had run behind the building about 100 yards to the train tracks to get a closer look at some of the police dogs. While behind the station, they spotted something on the tracks. A jacket was over one part and bricks were scattered all around as well. One of them thought what they saw was doll legs, but then further down the tracks, a boy yelled out that it was actually a baby. The boys immediately ran into the police station and reported what they saw. The railway was closed down, and it would be obvious that it was James due to his gray tracksuit and anorak jacket. Sadly, James had been run over by the train, his lower half sitting 15 feet away from his upper half. James' clothes not only had blood all over them, but blue paint on them as well. There was a heavy steel bar nearby which was also stained with blood, as well as several bricks and large rocks. A small tin of blue model paint was found not far from the scene, which matched the paint on James's tracksuit and jacket. The investigators knew this was no accident. James had extensive injuries, not just from the train. He had multiple skull fractures and over 20 other injuries like bruises, cuts, and scrapes. There's been no conclusive evidence of sexual assault given to the media at this time, but there were reports that there were injuries that were consistent with sexual assault. I should point out that the sexual assault aspect of the case has been argued, and I'm not sure that it's been 100% confirmed either way. Denise doesn't want to know, so she hasn't asked, but I do have a feeling though that it is true. Any teen or youth with any sort of issues or run-ins with the police were being looked into and questioned. All the boys who discovered James were also questioned as well. So in total, there was over 60 boys interviewed, but police still had to appeal to the public again. A local business not far from the Strand had CCTV set up in their car park, and they turned it over to the police to help. In their footage, they had an image of 2 boys and James walking past. The image showed the 3 walking past a short brick wall, which police used as a scale for height. It was then that they realized that it wasn't teenagers and these boys were actually much younger. They released a still from the video and showed it to the public, asking once again for assistance. Police finally got a breakthrough. A woman who had been on holidays for the past week walked into the police station saying that the boy in the lighter jacket could be her friend's son, Jon Venables. She knew he often skipped school and was always getting himself into trouble. She also believed the second boy to be Jon Venables' friend, Robert Thompson. Both only 10 years old. Officers would need to bring these boys in for questioning, but hearing that they were only 10, police thought it was a waste of time and couldn't imagine that it was them. These interviews, in their mind, were mostly to eliminate them as suspects. In the meantime, police contacted the school's headmistress, who confirmed their absence, as well as gave investigators their home addresses. Robert would be arrested first, with his mother accompanying him to the station. Robert never looked or seemed scared. He only cried briefly when police said that he had to go to the station to answer questions. But it wasn't a real cry, as they believed that they never saw any tears. The lead officer remembers that Robert didn't really look 10. He looked more like an 8-year-old, which was even more surprising to him. In fact, all of the interviewing officers had a really hard time with speaking with Jon and Robert because they were so young and so small. It didn't seem at all like they would be responsible for something so horrific. It was also difficult to ask them questions about the crime because the details were sensitive. And what if these weren't the killers? Jon Venables was also arrested at his mother's home, and she originally thought the police were there in regards to Jon skipping school and confirmed that Jon had indeed skipped school and came home with paint on his coat. She didn't indicate that she knew where he was, though. Police asked for the coat as well as the clothes that he was wearing, which were also stained with blue paint. Jon, too, was small for his age and seemingly immature. Jon was born August 13, 1982, and the second son of Susan and Neil. His older brother and younger sister both had learning disabilities. His parents suffered from bouts of debilitating depression, which resulted in the house being quite unkept, and the kids were left to take care of themselves, which could be described as chaotic due to the learning disabilities. Susan and Neil had divorced when Jon was about 3, and his mother had a hard time raising the kids on her own. One time, the kids were left for over 3 hours unattended, which resulted in the police being called and social workers being involved. In 1989, in primary school, it was noted that Jon wasn't social and complained of being bullied a lot. Jon's teacher also noted that Jon sometimes rocked back and forth in his chair or hit his head against the wall. He never did what he was told, and his behavior was really disruptive. A school psychologist was referred because he started to cut himself with scissors. Jon would be given a diet to see if that helped with his behavior. Now, I don't know how strict Jon's mother followed this diet, but Susan, Jon's mother, basically gave up helping Jon because she felt like nothing she did helped at all. Jon was finally kicked out of school after attacking another student and holding a ruler against their throat, cutting off the oxygen. Jon would be registered at Walton St. Mary's School, where he met Robert Thompson. Robert was born the 23rd of August, 1982, to Anne and Robert Sr., or Bobby Sr. Robert's parents had married in 1971 and had 5 children over the next 9 years. The marriage, unfortunately, was toxic. Bobby Sr. would get drunk and become violent. Robert once witnessed his mother lying injured on the floor after his father attacked her one day, but he wasn't allowed to help her. By 1988, Bobby Sr. left Anne for another woman, and this was when Robert was about 6 years old, and it was very hard on him. It was also hard on Anne because she began drinking. She just had a really hard time coping with everything. Basically, what happened was the older kids looked after the younger, but they all got into petty crime and all the boys got a bad reputation. Robert also started to hang out with other kids with similar issues. They often vandalized, skipped school, and broke into cars. Now, he and Jon became fast friends when they met and loved skipping school together. They were the kind of kids that just encouraged each other to break the rules and be defiant. It happened so much that the school often kept them indoors in separate rooms to try and control them and stop them from leaving. The head teacher who worked at St. Mary's when the boys were registered there remembers that Jon could often be disruptive and annoy the other kids. And when he did get in trouble, he often laid on the ground and had tantrums similar to toddlers. When the boys were interviewed for James's murder, they both denied everything. Robert had such a small voice and he didn't really seem nervous. He appeared to speak freely about himself, and neither of the boys seemed like killers. Robert would eventually admit to seeing James in the mall on Friday, and he goes on to say that James was with his mum, but also running around.
He grabbed the baby's hand and just walked around the strands. And then he let him go loose then.
Did he?
When we were by the church, he let him go.
And you were with John then? You shook your head? You shook your head?
Yeah. I told him to take him back.
You did what?
I told him to take him back.
You told him to take him back?
No,
All right, Bobby. No, you're not getting all the blame. We're just asking your son. We're trying to find the truth.
We'll make the blame.
Wait a minute, Bobby. Listen.
Robert would break down when he tried to explain that he told Jon to take the baby back to his mum. He also only watched everything, but he also didn't try and stop it. Robert admitted that he was there, but insisted it wasn't his fault. It's unbelievable to listen to these tiny little voices knowing what they had done to a 2-year-old child. Anne would be with Robert throughout the interviews and 100% believed that her son was innocent. Jon originally said that he wasn't even at the mall at all. It took over 4 interviews for any type of admissions from Jon, as he just continued to lie over and over.
He said that the 2 of you were in the Strand and that you saw the little boy.
We never.
Is that the God's honest truth?
God's honest truth, I'm telling you that we never. He was too scared. He was probably too scared.
And he said that you took him by the hand and led him out of the Strand shops.
We never. He's a liar.
Calm down.
Oh my gosh. Alright, it's alright. Come on, love. It's alright. Come on, alright.
I never got the boy. I never killed him.
Police confronted Jon with Robert's side of the story, and he started crying, saying that it was all a lie, that he wasn't at the Strands, and he tried to stand by his story. When Jon did finally admit to being with James, taking James's hand and leaving the Strands, but said it was Robert's idea to kill the boy. Jon's mom would tell him that they loved him and supported him, and that it was probably the only way to get him to talk was to show him some love. He would later admit and say, quote, "I killed James. Can you tell his mom that I'm sorry?" End quote. Their original plan was to throw James in the canal. One of them had asked James to look into the water so that they could push him in, but James refused. Robert would then push him down out of anger, and James would get a bump on his head. The 3 would then take a very long walk miles away from the mall to Barton Village. Jon blamed Robert for throwing bricks directly at James, and Jon was saying that he was pretending to, but actually just throwing the bricks on the ground. Jon also said that Robert found a metal bar and hit him in the head, which knocked him out. Now, the boys' stories became fairly consistent, but each other blamed the other person for the violence. And I think this is normal for kids. They will typically point the finger at another person to get less blame or get out of trouble. What isn't normal is their actions that day. Kidnapping, abusing, and murdering a baby is not normal. Psychologists and police would later believe that it was Robert who did most of the abuse and seemed to be the ringleader of the 2. Jon seemed like he was nicer of the 2, more polite and resourceful. Robert seemed more cold. On February 20th, 1993, the boys were charged with the murder of James Bulger. They were also charged with the abduction of James and the attempted abduction of another child belonging to Diane Power. It was alleged that 3 hours prior to James being taken, they tried to take Mrs. Power's 2-year-old child first. They had planned to push Mrs. Power's child into traffic to make his death look like an accident. So this whole abduction and murder of a child was 100% premeditated. The trial was very emotional. The boys were 11 when the child began, but they still looked really young. That didn't stop people from being completely outraged, though. Mobs would gather and throw rocks at the vans when the boys arrived. There was also 6 people arrested outside who just couldn't control their emotions. When the judge read the charges, the boys didn't flinch. And that's how they were for most of the trial. They wiggled and fidgeted, as kids do, and they didn't seem to be paying attention to what was being said. 37 witnesses came to the trial to testify, and they were all very emotional. And the questions did come up. Why didn't they call the police sooner? Why didn't they step in? Why didn't they ask more questions? And all of these thoughts would haunt the witnesses as well, but most of them said it's usually adults who kidnap kids. It never crossed their minds that this was an abduction or that James was in danger. The jury would hear about 42 different injuries, 32 blows to the head and face by various objects, and the tin of blue paint that was thrown at him as well. The attack wasn't quick. James had suffered badly before being left on the train tracks. Robert's shoes still had James's blood on them, and the metal rivets for his shoelaces had made imprints on James's cheek. They had walked 3 miles with the intention to hurt James. They never once stopped or considered to bring James back. Both the boys pled not guilty, and the prosecution had enough evidence to prove that they did, and there was no questions. The main hurdle of obtaining a guilty verdict was proving that they understood abducting a child and killing them was wrong. And I mean, at 10, they sure did know what they were doing was wrong. They also reinforced that they knew what was wrong by placing the blame on the other person. They were very manipulative and deceitful because they didn't want to get in trouble. Jon had even asked if his fingerprints could be taken from the baby's skin. This time was extremely difficult for Denise. She was still grieving, and her marriage was now suffering as well. Ralph turned to alcohol to numb the pain and spent most of his time in the pubs away from home. They also had unintentionally gotten pregnant again, which was hard. It was hard to be excited for a baby when you've lost and buried your first 2. Media had also put her pregnancy on blast because how dare she get pregnant so soon? So Denise was just broken. Denise wasn't able to go to the trial as it was just too stressful and she didn't want to risk her new pregnancy. Ralph, her husband, was so horrified after sitting in court the first day that he never went back. It was too hard to hear the details about what the boys did to their son. It was equally hard to see Robert and Jon in person. Even though the judge ruled that not all evidence was to be released during the trial, there was enough that they were found to be guilty. Some people would wonder if they would have received a harsher penalty if more of the evidence was presented, particularly the sexual assault elements, because all the boys got was 8 years. Unfortunately for Denise, the boys didn't get sent to prison. Instead, they were sent to what's called a secure children's home for their 8-year sentences. I believe these types of homes are for troubled kids who have been in trouble with the law but of more petty crimes like shoplifting or violence. Kids do live there full time, have strict rules and routines, schooling, and therapy. The focus is on rehabilitation and not incarceration like adult prisons are. And they often have gyms, pools, or days out to go to football games or other activities off grounds. I have read that the UK does have about 5 young offender institutions, which are more like prisons, but they're typically reserved for kids over 15. Robert and Jon were 11 during the trial. Now, I know some of my subscribers are from the UK, so maybe you can fill us in on where kids go who commit serious offenses like murder. Is this a typical punishment for an 11-year-old? Most of the community wanted these boys in adult prison. What they did was the worst of the worst, and a secure center for children just didn't cut it. Denise was more upset by the length of their stay and started a petition to have these sentences increased. And within a few weeks, Denise had 300,000 signatures, 4,400 letters of support. There was another 6,000 members of the public asking for a minimum of 25-year detentions. The tariff was raised successfully to 15 years, but the boys' lawyers fought hard to have that overturned, and unfortunately they won, and the tariff was reduced again to 7 years and 8 months. Now, the boys were sent to 2 different centers. Robert Thompson was sent to Barton Moss. The manager of Barton Moss spoke out later, and she remembers that Robert came in scared. He would curl up in his chair and sucked his thumb. He became very childlike and never wanted to talk about what happened. And this continued past the age of 13. He still wasn't able to talk about what happened. He told the staff he didn't have any feelings about James and that day. So he had completely disconnected himself from what he did. A psychologist's report pointed out the possibility of psychopathic behavior, but Robert was young and often disassociated when he was being spoken to, which is very concerning because most kids feel remorseful when they do bad things. In the first few years, Robert would pick fights with other kids at the center, throw things at staff, wrote on the walls, and banged his head purposely against the radiator. These outbursts would lessen as he got older. Finally, at 15, Robert was able to sort out his head about what happened and began to speak. Robert admitted that he was sexually assaulted by a relative from about the age of 6 until the arrest. He didn't like being at home and he was really angry all the time. Robert eventually started to show signs of progress. He matured and his behavior improved, and he was still emotionally withdrawn and manipulative towards other children in care, but he seemed to be getting better. In the spring of 2001, prior to his release, the psychopathic tendencies were dismissed, and it was said that Robert was well adjusted. Jon, on the other hand, went to Redbank Secure Children's Home in Maryside. And this place looks a lot tougher and more like our youth detention centers here in Canada. It's since been closed down and is currently sitting abandoned. Jon was told not to tell people he was there for murder and instead for stealing cars. He was also given a fake name because staff really worried about how other children would perceive him. Jon was said to be more troubled than Robert, which is opposite of what the police initially thought. They always thought Robert was the ringleader and colder. It's now said that it was Jon who suggested they take a kid and hurt them. The first few years at Redbank were really hard for Jon. He had to be physically restrained at times and was really isolating himself. There was a time when a care worker teased him by saying that Jon couldn't pull the skin off of rice pudding, and this angered Jon, and his response to this was, quote, "Bring me your baby and I'll batter it," end quote. Jon would be assessed as being immature. Basically, he was younger emotionally than his real age. He was also said to have attention deficit disorder, so they had him in art therapy where he would recreate the disappearance of James with marks on his face. He told his art teacher she should sell his art for millions. At the same time, he was also scared and had anxiety that people would break into the center and attack him for what he did. Jon also admitted to nightmares, and it took a full 2 years for Jon to admit his role in the murder. While the boys were in these secure units, the public learned that the boys were allowed out many times, sometimes for football games, sometimes to go to shopping centers, and sometimes to play with other school-aged kids who didn't know their identities. And this was part of the rehabilitation. Psychiatrists were trying to get them used to the public to make sure that they weren't institutionalized. The public was furious, though. Just before Jon's release, it said that Jon had intercourse with a female staff member from Redbank. The staff member was suspended, but this little incident didn't affect Jon's release, as it was kept quiet during his parole hearing. It apparently happened when Redbank was going through a management issue and facing a threat of closure. These management issues could also be why Jon was cleared and said to be rehabilitated when he probably wasn't. In June of 2001, both boys were released. Everyone was reassured that the boys were no longer a threat to the community. In efforts to protect them, an order was granted to give them new identities and lifelong anonymity. They would both work with parole officers for the rest of their lives, but the public were never to know who they were. The community was not happy. They started to threaten the boys' lives and didn't think that they were being punished enough. Liverpool was still grieving James when Robert and Jon were released. It just didn't seem like they had been punished enough. Now, Robert has managed to stay out of trouble as far as anyone knows. I've read that he is in a relationship and has been well adjusted in whatever community he ended up in. Jon, however, can't stay out of trouble. His real identity is still a secret, but information has been released on what has happened since his release. In 2008, Jon was arrested on suspicion of affray, which I believe is a charge for being physical towards another person where they would fear their life. And I believe it was a drunken bar fight. We don't have the specific charge in Canada. I think our version of this would be charged with assault. In this case, Jon was given a warning. He also developed a drinking and drug problem and compromised his identity at least twice by telling people that he was a convicted murderer. In February of 2010, he was given 2 years for making 57 indecent photos of children and 7 incidents of distributing indecent photos of children. Upon his release from his arrest, Jon was given a new identity again, and he was released in 2013 with another new identity. In 2011, word got out about how Jon and a female staff member from Redbank had intercourse, and Denise, James's mother, wanted a full inquest done. She felt as though Jon's stay at Redbank wasn't what it was portrayed to be, and had it been acknowledged that Redwoods was having management issues, maybe Jon wouldn't have been released. This inquest never happened. In 2017, he was arrested again and being caught with indecent images of children again. I've also read that he was online pretending to be a woman with a child who was offering others to abuse. In February of 2018, James Bulger's father launched high court proceedings against the order that protects Jon. His father didn't think that it was right that this man is getting protection. James's mother was on the other side. While she thinks he isn't a good person, she doesn't support vigilante justice, and that is exactly what would happen if his identity was released. In 2009, it was ruled that the protection order would continue to protect him from serious violence. Meanwhile, in 2018, Jon was sent to jail for 40 months after admitting to having over 1,000 indecent images of children. He also admitted to having a manual on, quote, how to have sex with little kids, end quote. He also has a strong fetish on watching other adults have sex with kids or kids being abused. This man is clearly not suitable for release. He has some major issues that will never be resolved. His identity was leaked again in 2018 while in prison, and another inmate threw boiling water at him. He asked for another new identity as well as plastic surgery to further disguise who he is. In 2020, he thankfully was denied parole, and the order is still standing that we must not know who he is. The only good thing about him being caught so many times is that the parole board now can make the decision to keep him in jail indefinitely if they feel it would be too risky to release him. His picture has been released, and I'm not going to post a photo of it here because it's said that people who break the order and reveal someone's identity could face up to 2 years in prison. I don't know if that's true, but I'm not going to risk it. But you know how Google works, so you can find it. With that said, a lot of people want his identity released. My thoughts? Now, I first want to say that this case was really hard to research. It's so sad in so many ways. Denise sounds like a wonderful mother. She tried to do everything to keep her son safe and loved him so much. I read her book called I Let Him Go, which was really eye-opening. It wasn't just about the case, it was about what she went through and what her family went through and how far the grief really spread. I'm glad I learned a different perspective on what was going on. Even though the boys were so young when they committed the crime, I sometimes have to agree that the sounds of these children's homes don't really seem like a punishment either. But is putting 11-year-olds in proper jail during their formidable years helpful? Probably not. Sure, Robert has stayed out of trouble, so I guess it worked for him. Having structure, rules, and therapy made him a better person, but it didn't work for Jon. Unfortunately, it's impossible to know why. Was it the therapy? Did his center have less structure? Would a proper youth prison have been better? We just don't know. Now, as an adult, I don't think Jon should be protected any longer. He hasn't been successfully rehabilitated. He is 1,000% a danger to society, and people need to know who he is and where he is, especially since he targets children. It's more dangerous for the community to have him anonymous. I've also read of people being tormented when rumors start about the real identities of Robert or Jon. For example, a man named Scott Bradley committed suicide after being accused of being Robert Thompson. He was being bullied endlessly and couldn't take it any longer. So if Robert and Jon's identities were released, it would stop people from speculating or making false accusations. I hope to see lots of comments on this one. I know it's a very polarizing case, so I do expect also to see views from both sides. Please let me know what you think. That's it for today. Thanks again for watching Felony Spectator, and we'll see you again soon.